Imagine that you settle down to sleep one night. You're in your jammies. The house is slightly cool, but it is warm beneath the covers. You perform whatever nightly ritual helps you to bring on the Z's, read a book or watch TV. You turn the lights out and soon you're off in dreamland. In the middle of the night, you wake with a start. It feels as though someone is attempting to smother you with a pillow. You jump out of bed, but it is still difficult to breathe. You struggle to find your way outdoors, thinking at last you've escaped the danger, but you haven't. It is even more difficult to breathe outdoors. Within seconds you pass out, and that's it. There is no waking up. In less than a minute, you and your whole family are lying dead on the sidewalk or front yard. Chemical gas leak? No, you just died from carbon dioxide gas, the same stuff you exhale with every breath.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleson. Today's episode was suggested by one of our listeners. It is about the gas eruption that took place at Lake Nyos in Cameroon on August 21st, 1986. More than 1,700 people and thousands of cattle were killed from suffocation as a result of what is known as a limnic eruption or degassing. It is one of the few disasters we have studied in which the victims had no forewarning of what was about to happen. The event was a complete surprise, and it took scientists years to determine the actual cause of death. Sometimes nature can be just as cruel as man. Carbon dioxide is a completely harmless gas. It is colorless and odorless. It is abundant in the Earth's atmosphere, and life would not be possible without it. It is produced by all aerobic organisms, that is, organisms that use oxygen to breathe, because carbon dioxide is a natural byproduct of breathing. Plants require it for survival during the process of photosynthesis, which creates the oxygen aerobic organisms need to exist. It naturally occurs in volcanoes, geysers, and hot springs, and can settle at the bottom of lakes. It is soluble, meaning it dissolves in water. If you're still not familiar with it, other than it being the stuff you breathe out whenever you exhale, you may recognize it as the bubbles in your carbonated beverage. And if you are a consumer of carbonated beverages, you are probably aware that the contents of that can or bottle contains a significant amount of energy. If you shake the vessel very hard before opening, it will release the contents with a great deal of force. Carbon dioxide isn't toxic, and it normally dissipates in our atmosphere. Normally, that's what happens. On the night of Thursday, August 21st, 1986, Ephraim Shea was sitting in his mud brick house situated on a cliff above Lake Nyos, located in tropical West Africa. Lake Nyos is a volcanic lake. It formed inside the crater of a dormant volcano. Around 9 p.m. that evening, Shea, a farmer, and his 4 children heard a rumbling that sounded like an explosion. Following this loud noise, Shea and his family saw what appeared to be a white mist forming above the lake. They thought nothing much of it. They were all feeling slightly nauseous and woozy, and decided the best thing was for all of them to go to sleep. Below Shea's house, on the lake's shore, Halima Suli, a cowherder, and her 4 children were sleeping when they heard the rumbling sound. She would recall that it sounded like a great many voices shouting all at once. Then a great breeze passed through the village of thatched huts where she and her relatives lived. The gust of wind was the last thing she remembered that evening, because something in the air caused her to pass out. In the village of Saboom, located downhill from the lake shore, Father Anthony Banksy and his colleague Father Lawrence were preparing to go to sleep. They had just gotten into their beds when they felt a scratching in their throats and a general uncomfortableness. Both detected the smell of sulfur, which is often compared to rotten eggs or gunpowder. Breathing became much more difficult for the both of them. The 2 priests left their cottage to go outside in the hope of getting fresher air. But it did not help, and just a few steps outside of their cottage they both passed out. Hours later, Father Banksy woke up with a tremendous headache, feeling a bit hungover. He reached over and shook Father Lawrence, but the priest didn't move. He shook him again. "Father Lawrence, wake up," he said. But he didn't move. Father Lawrence had passed away during the night. "The danger is still very fresh in my mind," Banksy said later. "The death was completely invisible. You could only tell it was happening when you saw the birds drop from the sky and animals fall over." Mayseline Ma, also a villager from Saboom, found herself alone in a hospital after the events of that night. Her body was covered with burns. The reason she was alone was because both of her parents and her 5 siblings died that evening from asphyxiation. Their supply of oxygen had been cut off by something in the wind. Other survivors had also been burned across their bodies. They too remembered the gust of wind and the smell of sulfur. Many of these survivors also remembered hearing an explosion. Some claimed to see a filthy mushroom cloud over the lake that spread out and passed over the ridge of the crater like floodwaters spilling over a dam. The deadly cloud killed 500 people in Saboom and thousands of cows in this cattle-herding region. There were very few survivors. After passing through Saboom, the cloud continued to rush forward through the valley and its ravines at an estimated 60 kilometers per hour toward the other settlements. In the village of Nyos, only 6 villagers out of a population of 800 survived the deadly fog. "I met corpses on the road and there was no life," Father Fred Tenhorn, a local priest, recalled. "There was absolute silence, not even any insects or animals. Everything had perished." The victims had collapsed without a struggle. Many of the dead in the worst-hit villages were men. As heads of their households, they had gone outside first to find the source of the pungent smell, and they died on their doorsteps as the gas cloud swirled past their homes. The rest of the families had followed suit, in a panic, rushing to get outdoors. Mayseline survived simply because she stayed inside her home where there must have been pockets of breathable air. She was one of the few who survived. Almost all of the 1,700 victims died within minutes of exposure to the cloud. Emergency assistance was painfully slow in reaching the stricken areas. It was late the next morning when the first survivor stumbled down off the mountain into Wum, a town of 26,000 people, 50 kilometers to the west. One survivor named Tem noticed people in his village were falling down, clutching their faces as the clouds of dust rolled in. He covered his own face and escaped, racing ahead of the cloud on a Suzuki motorbike to Wum. Another man was riding a bike to Nyos and found a dead antelope next to the road. He picked it up, thinking that this was his lucky day, and he tied it to his bike. 60 yards on, he found 2 dead giant rats. He picked those up. Further on, he found a dead dog, then more dead animals. His first thought was the deaths were caused by lightning. He went to the nearest clutch of huts on the remote road to ask what had happened. All he found there were corpses. He threw away his bicycle and the animals and he ran back to Wum. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, local police called the governor of the province, Walson Ntuba. Ntuba notified the capital in Yaoundé. It was the first news they had received of disaster, but they wouldn't know the true scope of what happened until much later. It wasn't until Saturday morning, 36 hours after the cloud formed, that Governor Ntuba and a medical team reached the villages around Lake Nyos. The nearest hospitals were far away from Wum, and the village of Nakombe, which had just a small number of doctors and nurses to help the wounded. That night, a group of government investigators and a medical team flew into the area from the capital. They found the terrain around the rim of the lake along with the surrounding vegetation scorched by the explosion. The level of the lake had dropped by about 1 meter, and the lake itself had turned a rusty red in color. The villagers were eerily silent. Bodies littered the doorsteps of the houses, which were built in neat rows shaded by orange trees full of ripe fruit. Wheelbarrows were upturned next to the owners' bodies. Food was left untended, cooking in pots until the flame burned out. Only the sound of a military helicopter broke the silence. The first foreign medical team from Israel was alerted to the tragedy late on Sunday afternoon. Dr. Michael Weiner, head of the 17-man team, was at home in Tel Aviv when he received a call at 5:30 p.m. Weiner rushed to Tel Aviv airport, and by 10:30 the impromptu team was ready to leave. They flew into Cameroon on Monday with the Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who was on an official 2-day visit. On Tuesday, the Israeli medical team packed up their trucks carrying supplies and drugs to Nakambe, taking 8 hours to traverse just 90 kilometers of dirt roads. Weiner described the injuries his team encountered. We were dealing with respiratory problems, including pneumonia, superimposed on the reaction to toxic gas, chemical burns, gastrointestinal problems, vomiting, diarrhea, plus swelling and weakness in limbs. What came next was not the usual outpouring of relief workers from developed nations to a developing nation in need. There were very few survivors. Those that did survive only needed minimal medical treatment. Unlike most other disasters, the affected area had been mostly left undisturbed. Eerily, all infrastructure and items in the villages remained intact, but almost all of the villagers were dead. Instead, the government of Cameroon asked for scientific help. They wanted to know what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Teams of volcanologists and other scientists began descending on the area of Lake Nyos. The early clues pointed to a volcanic eruption. The survivors had burns and remembered smelling sulfur. That odor was still present when the investigators arrived. There was also evidence of a recent rock slide. A promontory over the lake that had been covered with vegetation prior to the event was now bare. All of the evidence pointed towards some type of cataclysmic event. But how could a volcano or earthquake kill so many people without damaging any property? If the investigators were looking for a precedent, they wouldn't have to travel too far away or look too far back in time. On August 15, 1984, 2 years before the catastrophe at Nyos, a similar incident on a smaller scale took place at Manoun, a bone-shaped crater lake about 90 kilometers south of Nyos. Manoun is located in a heavily populated area, surrounded by farms and bordered in part by a road. Death came first to the earliest risers, those who had gotten up before dawn to trek from Ninjdown village southward to the coffee plantation where they worked, or to the market in Flambeau. The people who followed the early risers heard no cries for help up ahead. There was no scuffling, no running footsteps to warn them as they walked into the death trap. The last of the victims came in a white Suzuki pickup truck, traveling north toward the village. Inside its cab were 3 men. As they approached the lake area, the truck's engine sputtered and conked out. It was about 5 a.m. Just before dawn, Abdo Nakanjoni was biking northward to the village of Ninjdown when he descended into a dip in the road. Parked along the road, he found the Suzuki pickup truck, which he recognized as belonging to the local Catholic priest, Louis Curiop. Nakanjoni found him dead next to his truck. The other 2 men in the cab had scrambled out, detecting a strange, sulfur-like odor in the air. Moving along, Nakanjoni found another corpse, a man's body, still astride a stalled motorcycle. Some terrible accident had happened, was Nakanjoni's first thought. Sinking into a kind of trance, he became too weak to pedal and continued on foot. Nakanjoni passed a herd of dead sheep and more stalled vehicles whose occupants were dead. Moving away from the ghastly scene, he encountered his friend Adamu at the crest of a hill, walking toward him. He was going to warn Adamu to turn back, but by that point Nakanjoni had lost the capacity to speak. As though in a dream, he shook Adamu's hand silently, and the two continued in opposite directions. Nakanjoni made it into Ninjdown alive. "God must have protected me," he said. However, Adamu and 36 others traveling that stretch of road early that morning did not survive. A policeman and a local doctor, called to the scene around 6:30 a.m., noticed a faint whitish-gray 10-foot-tall cloud hugging the terrain. It was drifting away from the lake. When they stood at the edge of the cloud, the air smelled bitter. Then they became nauseated, weak, and dizzy. The policeman and doctor retreated. By 10:30, the cloud had dissipated. When the policeman and doctor moved down the road, they found the pickup truck, the priest, and the motorcyclist. And there were others. All had bloody foam oozing from their mouths and noses. Nearly all had defecated in their clothes, and all the rigid bodies had puffed faces and swollen stomachs. The exposed parts of their skin had suffered chemical-type burns, although their clothes were not burned. 2 of the people's faces had been burned so badly they could not be immediately identified. The area around the lake was littered with dead bats, rats, and snakes. The vegetation was discolored and withered. And there was something else. A 16-foot-high wave had flattened the grass and bushes on the eastern side of the lake. This damage was seen as far as 100 feet from the shoreline. Rumors about the disaster arose immediately. Some said that military plotters were attempting to mount a coup d'etat, or perhaps the government itself had carried out a chemical attack. There had been such a coup just 4 months earlier, and a suspicious plane flew over the lake earlier that evening. Conspiracy theories abound in Cameroon, where unexplained events are often attributed to political intrigues. But a few officials looked to the local geology, theorizing that the long-dormant volcano under Lake Nyos had reactivated. The Cameroon government then asked renowned Icelandic volcanologist Haraldur Sigurdsson to investigate. The first thing that Sigurdsson noticed after he arrived was that no autopsies were conducted, and no samples taken from Lake Nyos. Sigurdsson decided to interview the residents around the lake where the bodies were found. Many of the villagers mentioned the same thing. They had all heard an explosion sometime around midnight come from the direction of the lake. He then determined that all of the victims died in close proximity to the lake and all displayed burns across their bodies. But their clothing had not been burned or damaged at all. That would indicate that the cause was not an acid such as sulfuric acid, a natural byproduct of volcanic explosions. The policeman and the doctor mentioned the appearance of the gray mist to Sigurdsson. Venturing out to the lake several months after the incident, Sigurdsson performed an array of analyses and found no signs of a volcanic eruption. He detected no indication of temperature increase in the water, no disturbance of the lake bed, no sulfur compounds. But a strange thing happened when he hauled up a water sample bottle from the bottom of the lake. The lid popped off. The water, as it turned out, was loaded with carbon dioxide. The curious finding prompted Sigurdsson to theorize that the deaths around Lake Nyos may have been the result of carbon dioxide asphyxiation. Not only is carbon dioxide colorless and odorless, it is a gas heavier than air, meaning it will sink and displace oxygen wherever the 2 gases are present. Air that contains 5% carbon dioxide will snuff candles and stop car engines. A 10% carbon dioxide level causes people to hyperventilate, grow dizzy, and eventually lapse into a coma. At 30%, people gasp for breath and drop dead. So carbon dioxide is only deadly if it is allowed to pool or concentrate. There have been accounts going back to ancient times of animals and sometimes people dying from carbon dioxide exposure near volcanic vents. Sigurdsson, during his investigations, discovered a 100-meter deep volcanic crater at one end of Lake Nyos. He took more samples from the bottom of the crater, but there was no indication of disturbances or recent volcanic activity. Sigurdsson, after a few weeks, concluded that carbon dioxide, a byproduct of magma degassing, had percolated up into the lake's bottom layers of water, accumulating for years or possibly centuries. This created a giant hidden time bomb. The carbon dioxide venting from volcanic tubes will stay trapped at the bottom of a lake at greater depths because of the pressure exerted on it by all of the water above. In non-tropical parts of the world, where magma venting occurs, there are greater variances in temperature between the seasons. Cold water will sink in the winter and stir up the carbon dioxide, harmlessly releasing it into the atmosphere. But in equatorial Africa, winters and summers are hardly any different, and there is no natural stirring of the waters. At Lake Nyos, the gas built up over the years until some large-scale seismic event disturbed the pent-up gas, dissolving it in the water and suddenly causing it to explode, releasing a wave of concentrated carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If you shook up an unopened bottle of a carbonated beverage and then opened it, you would get the same result, and you would be acting as the seismic event. In your case, the amount of CO2 is very small. In the disaster at Lake Nyos, It was hundreds of thousands of cubic meters large. Sigurdsson wrote up his findings, calling the phenomenon a hitherto unknown natural hazard. He gave this phenomenon the name Lake Overturn, and stated that it could wipe out entire towns as the carbon dioxide settled in over populated areas and deprived people of the oxygen they needed to breathe. In 1986, just a few months before the Nyos disaster, Sigurdsson submitted his study to Science, the prestigious, peer-reviewed U.S. journal. Even though all of his data was well documented and his conclusions were sound, Science rejected his paper as far-fetched rubbish, and the theory remained unknown except to a few specialists. Then Lake Nyos blew up, killing 50 times more people than at Lake Manun. Word of the Nyos disaster spread quickly around the world. In Japan, a government official awakened Minoru Kusakabe of Okayama University at 1 a.m., inquiring if the geochemist would be willing to go at once to Cameroon. Kusakabe did not even know where the country was. French volcanologists, German, Italian, Swiss, and British scientists, U.S. pathologists, geologists, and chemists all would converge on Nyos. Many departed so precipitously that they carried little more than a briefcase, a change of clothes, and whatever scientific instruments they could grab. Among the Americans was limnologist, or a lake scientist, George Kling of the University of Michigan, who, as it happens, was making a second visit to the remote location. While studying the chemistry of Cameroonian lakes for his doctoral thesis the year before, he had sampled Nyos's waters from the shore because he didn't have access to a boat. The shallow water had yielded no hints of the dangerous gas in the depths. Now, a year later, the local boy who had guided him along the lake was dead, along with nearly everyone else he had met. I was numb, recalls Kling. I had always dreamed of going back there, but not like this. Sigurdsson was depressed. If his theory had been published and the authorities took proper action, most of those 1,700 deaths could have been avoided. Arriving within days of the disaster, the scientists themselves were fearful. No one was sure what had just happened, or if it was about to happen again. If it had been a volcanic explosion, who was to say there wouldn't be another sudden eruption? The Cameroon military had buried the human victims in mass graves. Thousands of cattle lay dead, their carcasses bloated and decomposing. Heavy rains then fell. Only the survivors' hospitality alleviated the grimness. They took the researchers into their houses and cooked meals of corn mush over open fires. "Can you imagine that?" said Kling's research partner, geochemist Bill Evans of the U.S. Geological Survey. "These people had just lost everything, and they were worried about us." Kling noted that there were no lava flows or fire fountains from volcanoes, and determined that it was safe to take samples from the middle of the lake. The scientists motored out onto Nyos in inflatable dinghies to take their samples and look for clues. Once again, some assumed that an underwater volcano had erupted, but others immediately grasped that the villagers around Nyos had perished under the same conditions previously documented at Manun, indicating that Sigurdsson's unknown natural hazard was real. What Kling discovered was that the lake temperature had not risen as one would expect after an underwater volcanic venting. If anything, the water temperature was cooler than normal. There were no traces of sulfur in the lake or around the edges of the lake as one would expect in a volcanic eruption. There was no sulfur in the bodies found in the villages. Over the ensuing weeks and months, the scientists would piece together the Nyos story. The crater lake is extraordinarily deep, more than 200 meters or close to 700 feet at its lowest point, and rests atop a porous, carrot-shaped deposit of volcanic rubble, a subaqueous pile of boulders and ash left from old eruptions. Carbon dioxide may remain from this old activity, or it could be forming now in magma far below. Wherever it comes from, underwater springs could transport the gas upward and into the deep lake bottom water. There, under pressure from the lake water above, the gas accumulated. In equatorial lakes like Nyos and Manun, the carbon dioxide could build up for centuries. The only thing missing was a triggering event. Something must have detonated the built-up carbon dioxide that August night 30 years ago. The most likely theory is that boulders tumbled into the lake at a high speed. The scientists at Nyos noted that a promontory adjacent to the lake bore signs of a fresh rock slide. Other possibilities included a fluky drop in air temperature that caused surface water to cool and abruptly sink, might have been the trigger, or a strong wind that set off a wave and mixed the layers. Whatever the cause, water saturated with carbon dioxide was displaced upward from the depths in a violent reaction. As it rose and the water pressure lessened, dissolved carbon dioxide bubbled up, and the bubbles drew more gas-laden water in their wake, and so on, until there was an explosion. The explosion, the scientists determined, had also brought up iron-rich water, which oxidized at the surface, giving the lake its rusty red appearance in the days after the deadly fog. Within a week, the lake had returned to its normal color of blue. Here's something else that was interesting about the death cloud at Lake Nyos. When carbon dioxide rises up from the bottom of a lake that is 200 meters below the surface, at that rate of pressure and speed, it would cool very rapidly when it hit the air. The result would be dry ice, carbon dioxide in its frozen form. If dry ice comes into contact with water, it will sublimate, or transition directly from a solid to a gas, and form that foggy vapor you'll often see used as a visual effect at rock concerts, magic shows, and haunted houses. Because the vapor from sublimated dry ice is so cold, much colder than water in its solid form, it can cause frostbite upon contact. Sigurdsson believes that the burns on the faces and bodies of the survivors was actually caused by frostbite, and not from hot gases or liquids. Imagine that, he said. Frostbite in Africa. It is an amazing thing, but it can happen. And what about the sulfur smell? Both Sigurdsson and Kling in their investigations could find no concentrations of sulfur residue in the area. There was no toxicological evidence implicating hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, or hydrogen sulfide in the deaths. Yet all of the survivors mentioned a strong smell of sulfur. So what was going on? The description of the odor of rotten eggs or gunpowder by survivors, although usually associated with sulfur gases, is also commonly described by individuals exposed to high concentrations of carbon dioxide. During his research, Kling found a medical survey conducted by the U.S. Air Force on the effects of oxygen deprivation on fighter pilots. It turns out that at concentrations above 5 to 6%, CO2 acts as an olfactory hallucinogen. That is, deprived of oxygen, the mind is tricked into thinking it is smelling sulfur. If this theory is correct, none of the survivors were actually smelling sulfur, but the lack of oxygen caused them to hallucinate the odor of sulfur. Piece by piece, Sigurdsson and Kling put the story together. There was a powerful thunderstorm on the evening of August 20th at Lake Nyos. That storm may have loosened the rocks that fell in the landslide, sending hundreds of boulders and debris into the lake. The boulders and debris would have tumbled as far as 300 meters to reach the bottom of the lake, where they disturbed the deposits of carbon dioxide that had been accumulating for perhaps centuries. Like a shaken bottle of champagne, the bubbles of carbon dioxide rapidly rose to the surface, causing an explosion and forming a giant cloud of carbon dioxide vapor at the top of the lake. This cloud, which may have been as large as a cubic kilometer in volume, swept over the edges of the lake and through the valleys, reaching villages as far away as 25 kilometers. Due to olfactory hallucination, the first people to come into contact with the cloud would have believed that they were smelling sulfur where there wasn't any sulfur. Immediately, the heavier CO2 gas would push down on the oxygen in the air and force it above the heads of the humans, animals, and insects. Anyone caught in this deadly cloud of CO2 would become dizzy and nauseous, passing out within seconds. They would also receive frostbite burns from the very cold temperatures of the CO2 cloud. Within a matter of minutes, everyone exposed to the cloud would die from asphyxiation or an inability to breathe oxygen. Death would be relatively painless. Only a lucky few would survive due to being above the CO2 cloud line or by finding a pocket of oxygen-rich air. Within hours, winds would dissipate the CO2, leaving no trace of the deadly cloud behind. The devastation caused by the degassing of Lake Nyos in 1986 led to a great deal of study on how to prevent a future occurrence. Scientists believe the rate of carbon dioxide entering the lake from volcanic flumes suggested that outgassings could occur every 10 to 30 years. However, a recent examination of the area indicated that the natural volcanic rock dam that holds back the lake's waters from the valleys below could collapse. In addition to the horrific flooding that would cause, the sudden release of water could reduce pressure on the lake's carbon dioxide deposits and cause another massive degassing much sooner than anticipated. Samples taken recently from the bottom of the lake reveal that carbon dioxide is quickly building up again. A team of European researchers independently proposed the installation of long degassing columns from rafts in the lake, based on the method currently in use for degassing explosive methane lakes. The principle is simple. A pump lifts water from the bottom of the lake, heavily saturated with CO2, until the loss of pressure begins releasing the gas and thus makes the process self-powered, kind of like siphoning gas out of a gas tank. In 1992, at Cameroon, and in 1995, at Nyos, a French team directed by Michael Halbwachs demonstrated the feasibility of this approach. In 2001, the U.S. Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance funded a permanent installation of degassing pumps at Nyos. Following the tragedy at Lake Nyos, scientists began looking at other tropical African lakes to see if a similar phenomenon could happen elsewhere. Lake Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo is 2,000 times larger than Lake Nyos. It was also found to be supersaturated, and geologists found evidence there for outgassing events that happened about every 1,000 years. The eruption of nearby Mount Nyiragongo in 2002 sent lava flowing into that lake, raising fears that a gas eruption could be triggered. However, that didn't happen as the flow of lava stopped well before it got near the bottom layers of the lake, where the CO2 deposits are located. Presently at Lake Nyos, the greater danger may not be the threat of degassing, but the collapse of the volcanic rock dam. The wall which holds back the water on one side of the lake is beginning to erode. Small streams of water are passing through cracks and accelerating the erosion process. If the wall were to collapse, it would endanger the lives of the 10,000 who live in the valley below. Despite the risks from carbon dioxide degassing and the possible collapse of the lake's retaining wall, the area is being resettled. For some settlers, it is a desire to return to their ancestral lands. For others, the rich, fertile valleys offer too much promise as productive farmlands. When I first began researching this topic, I thought the cause of the disaster would be easy to determine. In my mind, it was a natural event. Because the cloud of CO2 was colorless and odorless, I figured there was nothing that could have been done to prevent the deaths of so many villagers. But after reading about the events that happened after the gas release and the research that was conducted, I'm really disappointed in the editorial board at the journal Science. This is one of the reasons scientists publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals, to prevent future disasters. Sigurdsson was a renowned scholar in his field and a professor at Rhode Island University. He was no amateur. His article would have been published just months before the degassing event at Nyos. So many lives could have been saved. I can only hope that the editors learned from this experience. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. Or you can express your feelings through Facebook via an emoticon. This episode was based on a listener's suggestion, and what a great suggestion it was. I appreciate your feedback and ideas, and promise that future episodes will also be based on listener suggestions. Episodes like the sinking of the naval ship Wilhelm Gustloff, the Lisbon earthquake, and the Hillsborough crush came from your suggestions. Our next episode will examine the Ancash earthquake and avalanche in Peru. In May 1970, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of Peru and shook for a full 45 seconds. The damage from the quake was tremendous, killing thousands, knocking down houses and buildings, and cutting off power, water, and sewage to millions of people. Then came the landslide. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.